Hello, it is Heather King, author, retreat giver, and today, literary analyst. I've been dying. I have tons of stuff to do, but for some reason, I'm just on fire with the idea of kind of unpacking a Flannery O'Connor short story it's probably my favorite short story of hers of all time, which is saying something. It's called Good Country People. Um, I hope everyone knows who Flannery O'Connor is. If you don't, you really should, and you should learn about her and steep yourself in her short stories, which are they're almost as rich in a way as the Gospels. They work on so many different levels and they have so many different layers. They have a kind of allegorical almost element to them. But she, just in brief, was a Catholic short story writer and novelist. Died at the age of 39 of lupus, lived in rural Georgia, was an intellectual. She called herself a hillbilly Thomist. Uh, she read supposedly St. Thomas Aquinas before going to sleep each night, but she was super funny, had a gimlet eye, deeply Catholic. And I just want to, I've also been reading C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. And so deep is this story that I just wanted to read two quotes because these are, to me, one sort of backdrop to the story. Flannery O'Connor writes, not in the story but elsewhere, if other ages felt less. And the point is, she was so forward looking. She was so onto the perils of political correctness, of identity politics, of dividing people into the privileged and the oppressed, and all the privileged are horrible and all the oppressed are angelic. And she would have none of that. And this kind of phenomenon that we see ever more now where, the rights of people. I read something the other day. Okay, human right. What about the rights of God? But she really saw the perils of this kind of pity, quote, and compassion that is anything but in the long run for all of us. So she said, if other ages felt less, they saw more, even though they saw with the blind, prophetical, unsentimental eye of acceptance, which is to say, of faith. In the absence of this faith now, we govern by tenderness. It is a tenderness which, long cut off from the person of Christ, is wrapped in theory. When tenderness is detached from the source of tenderness, its logical outcome is terror. It ends in forced labor camps and in the fumes of the gas chamber. And C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man, which is a long essay, you all probably know it way better than I do, but he talks about this kind of bedrock of, he calls it the Tao, this bedrock of values by which humankind must live or else face extinction. And among them are those values, of course, are the protection of the weak and the vulnerable, and a sense of honor and a sense of justice, and a kind of longing for righteousness. Anyway, he says, and again, when we're divorced from God, from those values, it's like terror results. And he says the process, which, if not checked, will abolish man, goes on apace among communists and Democrats, no less than among fascists. It's not a political leaning, it's an existential stance. The methods may, at first, differ in brutality, but many a mild-eyed scientist in pince nez, many a popular dramatist, many an amateur philosopher, and I would add many of today's influencers and bloggers and journalists and amateur philosophers, all of it, which I am too. But in our midst means in the long run just the same as the Nazi rulers of Germany. So they both are pointing to the fact that these seeds of terror arise in our midst. They're not, it's not, a Hitler arises because we've divorced ourselves or we've rejected these values without which we're just going to absolutely fail. So, but the story is like all Flannery O'Connor stuff, just absolutely genius, entertaining. Even if you can't see or you're not Catholic or you don't, on any level, it's a wonderful story. But so Good Country People, it takes place in rural Georgia. There's 3 main women in it, and they're all kind of contemptuous of men. There's only one man. This has massive spoilers, so don't. If you want to read the story first, do it before you listen to this. One of them, and it starts out with this woman, and pay attention to their names, Mrs. Freeman, okay? And she's the hired help. She supposedly is good country people. The implication is these are simple people. They're salt of the earth. We're a little superior to them. And therefore indulge them and think well of ourselves for hiring them or mingling with them. But there's always this total noblesse oblige and sort of looking down on them. And the story starts with Mrs. Freeman, who's the hired sort of live-in maid, helps in the fields and so forth, with Mrs. Hopewell. Mrs. Hopewell is a landowner. She runs this farm in Georgia. She's divorced from her husband. That's the only thing it says about. She divorced him a long time ago. We don't know why or how, but the story starts with Mrs. Freeman, and I'm not sure why. I recently participated in a kind of panel, or not a panel, but a group discussion of the story. And part of the reason I wanted to make this video because I found it super unsatisfying. I felt like nobody saw it the way that I did. So often the case in this world, and that doesn't mean I have it right and no one else did. But and maybe the story is so deep we didn't have time to get to the very, very heart of it. But that was one of the questions we all said. Why did she start with Mrs. Freeman? I'm just going to read the first part of the first paragraph just to give you a flavor of Flannery O'Connor if you don't know her and the story. Because the neutral expression that she wore, besides the neutral expression that she wore when she was alone, Mrs. Freeman had 2 others, forward and reverse, that she used for all her human dealings. Her forward expression was steady and driving like the advance of a heavy truck. Her eyes never swerved to left or right, but turned as the story turned, as if they followed a yellow line down the center of it. She seldom used the other expression because it was not often necessary for her to retract a statement, but when she did, her face came to a complete stop. There was an almost imperceptible movement of her black eyes, during which they seemed to be receding, and then the observer would see that Mrs. Freeman, though she might stand there as real as several grain sacks thrown on top of each other, was no longer there in spirit. So, I mean, you could spend an hour just unpacking that. One theme that I'm not going to go into too deeply, but one huge theme in the story is sight. No one in the story sees themselves clearly, nor do they see each other clearly, nor do they see reality clearly. And the kind of focal point, Joy/Helga, who I'll get to in a minute, wears glasses and loses them in the end. So there's all these layers of sight. Anyway, so Mrs. Freeman, is hired by Mrs. Hopewell. And Mrs. Hopewell is a landowner. She's kind of the typical sort of bougie, thinks there's this really funny line. Mrs. Hopewell had no bad qualities of her own. This is what she thinks of herself. But she was able to use other people's in such a constructive way that she never felt the lack. She had hired the Freemans and she had kept them for 4 years. So Mrs. Freeman is married, but the guy, we never see the man. He has a good reputation. She has a reputation for just insufferable nosiness. And she thinks she's quicker than her husband. Mrs. Freeman and Mrs. Hopewell, it's kind of trash Mr. Freeman, who remains off stage in a sense. Yeah, we both know you're quicker than him. So there's this kind of contempt for men, or this kind of overarching men are not especially needed, which is kind of a subtext. But so Mrs. Hopewell thinks very well of herself because she's been so magnanimous as to hire Mrs. Freeman, good country people. But the fact is, and it's kind of buried in here, she was the only person who sort of showed up when the offer was put out. She'd hired them in the end because there were no other applicants. So Mrs. Hopewell, while in a surface way, kind of placating because she needs Mrs. Freeman to help her, is kind of contemptuous of her, and vice versa. So it's such the stuff of our daily life. But so enter the real focal point of the story, Joy, who is Mrs. Hopewell's only child. Her daughter, I think she's 32 years old, and Joy has had the bottom half of her leg shut off, one of her legs shut off in a hunting accident when she was 10 years old. She was conscious the whole time, so obviously there's a huge trauma. And Mrs. Freeman is fascinated by this fact. She looks at Joy as if she were a sort of fascinating animal. Mrs. Freeman loves other people's suffering and likes to read about people's illnesses and miscarriages and things like that. But anyway, Joy has gone off to college and has clearly received the kind of education that people receive, even back in the 60s when I think, 50s and 60s probably when Flannery O'Connor was writing these stories. And the education is devoid of virtue, the kind of teaching the virtues. I mean, we can kind of read into this. And she, of course, believes in absolutely nothing, or professes to believe in nothing. There's a point where she is reading a book, Joy, at home, because she lives at home, by the way, because she's come home from college. She has a weak heart, so was supposed to sort of die young, and also can't take care of herself. So she's home with her mother. This is a typical, I'm sure in some way based upon herself, because Flannery O'Connor also lived with her mother, who owned a dairy farm, and the father had died. But anyway, so Joy is home under duress and is just absolutely contemptuous and goes about sighing and pouting and surly and just making fun of her mother and her ridiculously shallow, platitudinous ways. At one point, Mrs. Hopewell comes across a book that Joy has left open. Opening it, she read at random, quote, "Science, on the other hand, has to assert its soberness and serious afresh and declare that it is concerned solely with what is, nothing. How can it be for science anything but a horror and a phantasm?" So it's just this academic gibberish gobbledygook in which now we're truly inundated, the water in which we swim. Mrs. Hopewell felt like she had come upon some evil incantation in gibberish. She shut the book quickly and went out of the room as if she were having a chill. So there's this huge element also of good and evil. Good. These are the themes I see: the good and evil, the perils, as I said, of sort of remaking ourselves in our own image, and also the absolute beauty and glory, in a way, of the church's teachings on marriage and the family that are meant to protect all of us, but especially the woman. So anyway, so how Joy is just, she goes about in an ugly yellow skirt, and she's like a child in a, even though she's kind of a big hulking thing, and goes about in this sweatshirt with a cowboy on a horse in it. But this is the thing. So once Joy had gotten away to college, she had renamed herself, and this is so genius, and because this is what we see today, where I refuse the identity of the beautiful creature that God made, and I'm going to put on another identity, and I'm going to force it on you, by the way. And Joy is a virgin also. She's never even been kissed, and she thinks men are stupid, or professes to believe they're stupid. So here's the thing. Her name was really Joy, but as soon as she was 21 and away from home, she had her name legally changed. Mrs. Hopewell was certain that she had thought and thought until she had hit upon the ugliest name in any language. Then she had gone and had the beautiful name Joy changed without telling her mother until after she had done it. Her legal name was Hulga. So there's also a deep underlying this whole idea of beauty versus ugliness, beauty as a virtue, subtext of beauty versus ugliness. And the word ugly is used many, many times. And Hulga, Joy/Hulga has willfully made herself ugly. And Mrs. Hopewell goes about saying these horribly, these things that are actually true. That's things like, oh, if you only smiled, even ugly people or ugliness, you can bring beauty into the world instead of ugliness, which drives Hulga insane. But there's this great line about how Hulga saw her adoption of this new name as her highest creative act. She has no procreative, she's squelched her all procreative kind of capacity and urge, and therefore she is toward ugliness and toward death. She has remade herself in her own image. And there's this wonderful paragraph. She considered the name her personal affair. She had arrived at it first purely on the basis of its ugly sound, and then the full genius of its fitness had struck her. She had a vision of the name working like the ugly, sweating Vulcan. So here's a reference to paganism, mythology. The ugly, sweating Vulcan who stayed in the furnace and to whom, presumably, the goddess had to come when called. She saw it as the name of her highest creative act. One of her major triumphs was that her mother had not been able to turn her dust into joy, but the greater one was that she had been able to turn it herself into Hulga. So there it all is. I mean, now we have pronouns. We have, remaking ourselves, our highest creative act. I'm going to remake myself. If I'm a man, I'm going to purport to remake myself as a woman. And there is an ugliness to it because creation is the beautiful act, and when we try to exercise powers that we don't have to change it. We only mutilate it. But it's very interesting. There's two times that Flannery O'Connor uses the word goddess in the story, and this is one of them. The ugly, sweating Vulcan who stayed in the furnace and to whom presumably the goddess had to come when called. And there's this very interesting, Helga who despises men supposedly, and yet this appeals to her on some subconscious level that the man would come, as it does, especially as women, that we have this, we want to, in a sense, be ravished, that the goddess had to come when called, or even just completely apart from sort of romantic or sexual connotations, that we have in us some urge to sort of obedience, to come when called. So I will try to remember to get to the other time that he uses it, because she uses the word goddess because it's a complete obverse. So anyway, that's kind of the setup, and into it comes one day, knocking at the door, this Bible salesman. And his name is, genius name, sense of humor, Manly Pointer. So Manley, Manly Pointer. And to me, the Bible salesman, he's this 19-year-old kind of callow youth. He's a trickster. His pants are too short. His yellow socks are pushed down. But he's very earnest, and he's sort of pushes his way in, and yet just seems eager. And he is, to me, the personification of evil. And he is a stealer of innocence, of virginity. He comes in the guise of something else. There are adjectives that imply a kind of serpentine. He pops up from the bushes. He's presents himself as eager, and yet his eyes are darting around the room. He's taking the full measure. The minute he enters that door, he has the bead on Mrs. Hopewell, and then Helga makes an appearance, and it's kind of, oh, please. He takes it, and you wonder, it's interesting because he's almost like Legion, the kind of devil who roams about the world seeking the ruin of souls. He doesn't come from anywhere. He doesn't have a town that he comes from. He comes from near a town. So he just kind of appears. Anyway, so there's this great scene where he says, he asked Mrs. Hopewell, "Oh, do you have a Bible?" "Bibles," the young man said, and his eyes raced around the room before he added, "I see you have no family Bible in your parlor. I see that is the one lack you got." Mrs. Hopewell could not say, "My daughter is an atheist and won't let me keep the Bible in the parlor." She said, stiffening slightly, "I keep my Bible by my bedside." This was not the truth. It was in the attic somewhere. So this is Mrs. Hopewell, who has no bad qualities except she's a liar, as we tend to be. What the Bible salesman, in his infinite sort of craftiness and wildness, he plays upon her sort of white guilt, we would call it today. "Oh, I'm just good country people. I'm just good, simple country people. I know you wouldn't be interested in buying a Bible from me." And he seduces her in that sense, in a way. And isn't this what we as a culture have totally fallen prey to, especially these recent years? We're so eager to virtue signal and say, no, I love the downtrodden and the oppressed and the other and the, no, I'm down with you. And in fact, I'm bad and you're all good. And so she invites him in and sits and has lunch with him, even though she says later he bores her to tears. But like a good people pleaser, and she doesn't want to think badly of herself. She doesn't want to think she's not kind, she's not tender, she's not down with the good country people. So in he comes and sort of weasels his way. In a sense, he seduces, you could say, in a kind of emotionally, Mrs. Hopewell first. Anyway, she finally says, I have to go somewhere. And he leaves. And then, though, she sees him outside talking to Helga, Joy / Helga. And it turns out they have a little conversation, and he expresses, he kind of says, oh, you're cute. I've never seen anyone quite like you. He starts in. And Joy, of course, who thinks she is impervious to such ridiculous, she's quite a bit older than him for starters, but also he's a country bumpkin, she's this highly educated, but anyway, they arrange to meet the next day, and she kind of stays up half the night thinking about it, and is kind of thinking, oh, the poor simple thing, he's attracted to me, well, maybe I'll just seduce him, and then he, of course, in his innocence, will feel horrible afterward, but I, in my magnanimous, superior, intellectual, nihilistic way, will set him straight and heal his shame. And it is such a picture of what we women have been led to believe. Oh, we will take control, we will just sleep with whoever, and we will be in power or have equal power. And it never, ever works that way. If my own life and experience have been any indication, this is in the very, very long past, so I can laugh kind of about it, but it's just not, we're just not made that way. So that's her thought. Anyway, he comes back the next day, and somehow Mrs. Hopewell and Mrs. Freeman don't catch wind of this, and so the two of them, and Helga has kind of put on a pair of slacks for the occasion or something. She's put a little drop of vapor rub on her neck for perfume or something. Anyway, the two of them make their way across the backfield, way, way, way across to an outbuilding that has a hayloft in it. They walk up this ladder together, so there's this whole there's a gate, and there's a ladder, and there's a hayloft, all these kind of, deeply symbolic. So they get up there, and obviously they're going up there to be together in some way. Helga doesn't quite know what, but and he's again sort of flirting with her and seducing her, and he asks at one point, and she's a little taken aback, or quite a bit taken aback, and he says, where does your wooden leg join on? Because he too looks at her like a fascinated animal. She can't remember where she's seen that look before, and we, the reader, know, oh, that was Mrs. Freeman looking at you that way. So he asks her about it, and they get up to the hayloft, and they start kissing. And as happens with us women, the minute they kiss, well, first of all, she thinks she's totally in control. Okay, so she does this thing of, is this all it is? And she thinks she's in control. She's totally detached. But then it comes around, and he, first of all, he takes her glasses. He says, let me have your glasses. And he puts them in his pocket. And she's so unobservant of the things around her. She doesn't like beauty, so she never looks at flowers or birds or trees or anything like that. So it doesn't, everything's kind of blurry anyway. So it doesn't really dawn on her at first that he's taken away one of her senses that she depends on. But anyway, he then, as things progress, says, let me take off your wooden leg. And it's this like shocking moment. She's already told him she doesn't believe in God. He's kissing her again and again. His breath was clear and sweet like a child's, and the kisses were sticky like a child's. He mumbled about loving her and knowing when he first seen her that he loved her. So he's just feeding her all these lies. And he says, you got to say you love me. She tells him, I don't have illusions. I'm one of those people who see through to nothing. So they're having this kind of, deep so-called conversation. She looks at him and says, oh, you poor baby. And then he leaned over. She smiled, looking dreamily out onto the shifty landscape. She had seduced him, with even making up her mind to try. How, she asked, in other words, how can I show you that I love you? How, she asked, feeling that he should be delayed a little. He leaned over and put his lips to her ear. Show me where your wooden leg joins on, he whispered. So it is this shocking moment. The girl uttered a sharp little cry, and her face instantly drained of color. However, she lets him do it, and he wants to remove her leg, and it is this symbolic defloration. She's very sensitive about her leg. She's shy about it, and yet proud of it in a weird way as we feel vulnerability around our wounds. But she lets him take the leg off. He rolls her slack leg, and she shows him where it joins on, and the ugly jointure where it was attached to the stump. He says, now the boy's face and his voice were entirely reverent as he uncovered it and said, now show me how to take it off and on. She shows him. He took it off himself, handling it as tenderly as if it were a real one. See, he said with a delighted child's face, now I can do it myself. Put it back on, she said. Now she was thinking, and this is the part about like we women who think we're going to be in control. Now she was thinking she would run away with him, and that every night he would take the leg off and every morning put it back on again. So she has surrendered to him. She has given herself to him. And like we do, it's like, oh, we're going to run away and get married, and then we'll make love every night. I mean, that's basically what she's saying. Not yet, he murmured, setting it on its foot out of her reach. Leave it off for a while. You got me instead. So what happens is, so now he's got her glasses, he's got her leg that he's put out of her reach, and then he says he's got his little Bible, his little suitcase that he carries his Bibles in, supposedly. He opens it up. He pulled the valise toward him and opened it. It had a pale blue spotted lining, and there were only 2 Bibles in it. He took one of these out and opened the cover of it. It was hollow and contained a pocket flask of whiskey, a pack of cards, and a small blue box with printing on it. He laid these out in front of her, one at a time, in an evenly spaced row, like one presenting offerings at the shrine of a goddess. So now it's like the shrine of a hideous kind of whore of Babylon, condoms, pornographic playing cards, and booze. This is a good country people, simple Bible salesman. He put the blue box in her hand. This product to be used only for the prevention of disease, she read, and dropped it. Aren't you, her voice when she spoke had an almost pleading sound. Aren't you, she murmured, aren't you just good country people? So here is the supposed non-believer who's gone beyond the Tao, the treasury of values that undergird civilization, and she realizes, as we do, or we do if we're lucky, you might think you don't believe in God. You might think you've gone beyond the values, traditional values of decency and honor and protection of chastity and the vulnerable. But this is what lies on the other side of that. Trust me, you want to believe in God. So here he is, and give me my leg, she said. He pushed it farther away with his foot. Come on now, let's begin to have us a good time, he said coaxingly. We ain't got to know one another good yet. And you think he's going to rape her, But in a way, he already has. He doesn't, but he says, "What's the matter with you all of a sudden?" he asked, frowning as he screwed the top on the flask and put it quickly back inside the Bible. "You just a little while ago said you didn't believe in nothing. I thought you was some girl." Her face was almost purple. "You're a Christian," she hissed. "You're a fine Christian. You're just like them all. Say one thing and do another. You're a perfect Christian. You're—" The boy's mouth was set angrily. "I hope you don't think," he said in a lofty, indignant tone. And look at how the tables have been turned. "I hope you don't think I believe in that crap. I may sell Bibles, but I know which end is up. And I wasn't born yesterday, and I know where I'm going." So he takes off. He takes off. He packs up his valise. He goes down. She sees him blurrily taking off across the field. She's left in the hayloft, having been completely stripped of her delusions and innocence. And that's the, quote, good in the story, as is so often true with Flannery O'Connor. She is not a pessimist or a tragedy. She always allows for the opening of grace, and it often comes in very violent, at least emotionally, spiritually violent ways. So we're left wondering. Helga's left in the hayloft. How is she going to get down? What is she going to tell Mrs. Hopewell and her mother? And like, how is that even going to play out? And so Mrs. Hopewell and Mrs. Freeman are in the back pasture digging up onions. This is the end of the story. They see the preacher emerge a little later from the woods and head across the meadow toward the highway. "Why, that looks like that nice, dull young man that tried to sell me a Bible yesterday," Mrs. Hopewell said, squinting. "He must have been selling them to the Negroes back in there. He was so simple," he said. "But I guess the world would be better off if we were all that simple." So it's just genius. And again, it just shows the perils of trying to remake ourselves in our own image, of purporting to believe in nothing, of trying to divide people into two camps, trying to assuage our consciences in a way by not changing anything about the way we live or examining our consciences, but by saying, "Oh yes, let's divide people into good and bad. I'm one of the privileged ones, so therefore I'm bad, and all the other, they're all angels." And it's like, well, things aren't that simple. We all have, that's not the way the world works. And to purport to believe it does is right, to exercise that excess, that false kind of tenderness, which Joy/Helga felt toward the Bible salesman. It's so incredibly patronizing and condescending to that kind of idea, because the implication is I'm actually superior and no better than you, and am morally, ethically, and every other way superior, intellectually, but I'm going to, out of the goodness of my heart, bestow on you my largesse while remaining completely actually in control and thinking I'm a good person. So anyway, unbelievably fantastic story. I had no idea. I just didn't know how long this would take. But now I feel like I have kind of said some of what I would like to say about good country people. Yes, and also it's got that it's kind of buried in or not buried, but another subtext. This whole, women thinking we're going to be in control and seduce the guy, and somehow that never also pans out quite, I think, the way we envisioned it. So anyway, happy blessed second week of Lent, and there's some good Good meat, I hope to chew on. But you could just read this story forever. I mean, I barely scratched the surface of it with all that. So thank you so much for listening, and see you next week.